Frost had already crept beneath the floorboards of the Caldwell house on the night Prudence stopped counting the bruises, not because they had stopped coming, but because she had run out of places on her body that didn't already hurt. The town of Harrow's Crossing, pressed hard against the gray stone shoulders of the Canadian Rockies in the bitter winter of 1887, was the kind of place that prided itself on two things: the quality of its lumber and the discretion of its people. It sat in the valley like a coin dropped at the bottom of a well, surrounded by peaks so steep and dark they blocked the afternoon sun by 3 o'clock. The townspeople lit their lamps early and drew their curtains early, and if they happened to hear something unsettling from the Caldwell property on Birch Hollow Road, they found it remarkably easy to mistake it for the wind off the mountain. Prudence Caldwell had been 21 years old when she married Lawrence. She was 24 now, and she felt 100. She had not always been the woman who flinched when a door opened too fast. There had been a version of her, a girl who sketched elk in the margins of her schoolbooks, who could name every wildflower in the alpine meadow above her father's sawmill, who laughed loud enough that her mother used to say she rattled the windows. That girl felt like a character from a book Prudence had read once, long ago, belonging to someone else's life entirely. Lawrence Caldwell was Harrow's Crossing's most prosperous merchant. He owned the general store, the feed warehouse, and had controlling interest in the only grain elevator within 40 miles. He was handsome in a gray, severe way, with close-cropped silver temples at 38, and the posture of a man who expected the world to arrange itself to his comfort. On their wedding day, he had shaken her father's hand with the air of a man finalizing a transaction he already considered completed. Her father, a good man broken by 2 catastrophic winters and a mill fire he'd never fully recovered from, had accepted the arrangement with the desperate gratitude of someone offered a lifeline. The first time Lawrence struck her, it had been over a pot of tea left to go cold. Not a slap. Prudence would later understand that slaps were for men who still cared what the bruise looked like in the morning. Lawrence used the back of his forearm, a heavy sweeping blow that caught her across the ear and sent her into the sideboard, scattering her mother's good china across the kitchen floor. She had stood there, kneeling among the shards, the high metallic whine in her skull drowning out everything, and waited for him to say he was sorry. He had stepped over the broken pieces, poured himself a fresh cup, and gone to read his paper by the fire. She had learned to keep the tea hot after that. Over the following years, Lawrence refined his methods the way a craftsman refines his tools. He understood the social arithmetic of a small town, what bruises could be explained, which injuries invited too many questions. He learned the topography of her body with cold precision, favoring the ribs, the backs of the arms, the soft tissue of the stomach. Prudence learned to breathe carefully in the weeks after a bad night. She learned to lace her corset so that the stays braced her fractured ribs, and to smile at Reverend Pickard's wife across the church aisle, as though the muscles in her face belonged to her. The town knew. Towns like Harrow's Crossing always know. Mildred Tate, at the dry goods counter, had seen the way Prudence's hands trembled when she signed her husband's account ledger. Old Dr. Taine, Forsyth had set her wrist twice, accepting Lawrence's explanation about icy porch steps with the blank, careful face of a man who had decided not to look too closely. Even Constable Aldous Webb, a man whose tin star had been gifted to him by the town council, largely because he was Lawrence Caldwell's cousin by marriage, had sat across from Prudence one February evening when a neighbor had finally summoned him over the sound of breaking furniture and told her, with genuine regret tugging at the corners of his mouth, that there was very little the law could do about what happened between a husband and wife behind their own 4 walls. Lawrence had handed his cousin a bottle of good rye on the way out the door. By the winter of her 4th year, Prudence had begun to do something quiet and private and terrible. She had started making peace with the idea of not surviving. Not actively, not as a choice, more as an inevitability she had simply stopped arguing with. The girl who had once named wildflowers had slowly accepted that the mountain above town would still be beautiful, whether she was alive to see it or not. The night that changed everything arrived on a Thursday in late November, during the worst early-season blizzard anyone in Harrow's Crossing could remember. Lawrence had come home from the grain elevator in a fury that Prudence could feel through the walls before he even opened the door. There had been a dispute with a consortium out of Calgary, buyers who had pulled their contract and taken their business east, costing Lawrence a sum that bruised his pride far more than his ledger. She heard his boots on the porch steps. the particular flat-footed, deliberate weight of them, and she knew the quality of what was coming. She was standing at the kitchen work table, rolling pastry. She had the presence of mind to set down the rolling pin. He came through the door and did not remove his coat, which meant he did not intend to stay long enough to neat it off. "The kitchen smells like grease," he said, by way of announcement. "I was baking," Prudence said. Her voice was steady. She had learned to keep her voice steady. "You've let the fire get too high. You're wasting wood." She moved to adjust the damper. She was not quick enough. His hand caught the back of her head, driving her face forward into the wooden edge of the work table. The crack of her nose breaking was something she felt more than heard. A deep, intimate percussion she had come to recognize. The world went white at the edges. She tasted blood, thick and copper, coating the back of her throat. She was on the floor. She did not remember getting there. Lawrence stepped over her legs to reach the damper himself, adjusted it with practiced calm, then turned to look at her with the expression of a man observing an inconvenient spill. "Get up," he said. "You're bleeding on the floor." She could not get up. Her vision kept sliding sideways, the kitchen tilting like the deck of a ship. Through the front window, she could see the blizzard had gone from heavy to absolute, a howling erasive white that had swallowed the lampposts and the fence line and the outlines of the neighboring houses entirely. Somewhere out there in that biblical white nothing, she thought. Very clearly, no one is coming. She was right about almost everything except that. Nate Drummond had no business being in Harrow's Crossing that night. He was a trapper and a timber scout, 42 years old, solitary by long practice, with the kind of face that looked like the mountain had made it itself. All granite angles and weather damage, a jaw like a shelf of rock, pale green eyes that assessed whatever they looked at with the patient. Unblinking calm of a man who had learned that most things in the wilderness would either kill you or leave you alone, and that the correct response to either was to take your time and think clearly. He came down from the high passes only when his pack frame was full or his supply list grew urgent. He had no attachment to Harrow's Crossing specifically. It was simply the nearest settlement to the stand of timber he'd been scouting on contract for a Vancouver lumber operation, and the blizzard had closed the pass behind him with the finality of a door slamming shut. He tied his horse at the livery at the south end of town, overpaid the boy on duty by enough to ensure the animal was well bedded, and walked north through the storm toward the lit windows of the Caldwell's Hotel, which was the only establishment in town he could see through the whiteout. He passed Birch Hollow Road at the exact wrong moment, or the exact right one depending on how you counted. He heard it through the wind. Not clearly, not identifiably, just a sound beneath the sound of the storm that made the back of his neck prickle in the particular way it did when something in the wilderness was suffering badly. He stopped walking. He stood in the street with snow driving hard against the side of his face, and he listened. It came again, a sound that wasn't the wind. Nate turned and looked down Birch Hollow Road. Through the white chaos of the storm, the Caldwell house at the end of the lane was lit from within, the windows glowing amber in the dark. One ground floor window had a curtain half pulled aside. Even as he watched, the curtain was drawn shut from the inside. He looked at the neighboring house. A light was on upstairs. He could see distinctly the silhouette of someone standing at the window looking down the street. Even as he watched, the light went out. Nate Drummond had lived a solitary life in part because he found the particular cowardices of civilization difficult to tolerate. He walked down Birch Hollow Road. He did not knock. The door was solid timber, reinforced, with a brass lock that would have stopped most men. It did not stop Nate. He hit it once at the frame with the full weight of his shoulder and the considerable mechanical advantage of his height, and the frame gave with a sound like a rifle shot, spitting splinters across the entry hall. The blizzard poured in immediately, guttering the hall lamp, filling the house with snow and the howling dark. Lawrence Caldwell spun from the kitchen doorway with an expression Nate had seen before. Not fear exactly, but the particular offended shock of a man whose absolute sovereignty over a particular space had never been seriously questioned. What in God's name? Nate had already looked past him. He had already seen Prudence on the floor. He had already stopped listening to Lawrence Caldwell entirely. The merchant, recovering his composure with the speed of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, straightened his coat and raised his voice to the pitch he used for debtors. "I don't know who you are, but you have broken into my home and you will answer to Constable Webb for it. Get out of my house." Nate crossed the kitchen in 4 strides. "Lawrence, belatedly understanding that something had changed in the architecture of his evening, reached for the shotgun he kept propped beside the kitchen door. He didn't reach it. Nate took the man's wrist with one hand, not violently, with the dispassionate efficiency of someone removing an obstacle, and pivoted him hard into the wall. Lawrence's head connected with the plaster. The shotgun clattered away. Nate drove his elbow into the merchant's ribs with a force that folded him to the floor like paper, and then stepped back and crouched beside the woman who was bleeding quietly into the kitchen floorboards. "Hey." His voice was very low, very calm. "You with me?" Prudence opened one eye. The other was swelling shut already, the lid puffing with alarming speed. She looked at the enormous, snow-covered stranger crouched over her, and, because she had been conditioned by years of pain to expect the next blow, she tried to pull herself backward toward the wall. Easy. He didn't reach for her. He kept his hands where she could see them, broad palms down on his knees. "I'm not going to touch you unless you say so. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" She stared at him. The question was so foreign to her, the posture of it, the patience of it, that for a moment she simply could not process it. "My nose," she managed. "My side. Ribs. Maybe." He nodded slowly, taking inventory with his eyes, not his hands. "Can you stand?" Behind them, Lawrence was trying to. He had gotten to his hands and knees and was making the breathless, outraged sounds of a man who had never before experienced consequences. "I will have you hanged," he wheezed. "I will have you buried in this valley, you." "Sir." Nate did not turn around. His voice didn't rise. "If you finish that sentence, I am going to have a much less patient conversation with you. Stay on the floor." Lawrence stayed on the floor. Constable Webb arrived 18 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, flanked by his single deputy, a young man named Porter who looked frightened enough to be physically ill. Webb took in the scene with the deliberate slowness of a man calculating which account of events would be most convenient. "Drummond," he said. He knew Nate, at least by reputation, the way men in the valley knew each other, by their useful skills and their capacity for trouble. "Step away from Mrs. Caldwell." "I don't think I will," Nate said. He was standing now, Prudence leaning heavily against the wall behind him, a dish towel pressed to her face. "I think what you're going to do instead is look at that woman and tell me, out loud in front of your deputy, that this is the first time you've had cause to visit this house." Webb's jaw moved. Nothing came out. "That's what I thought." Nate looked at the constable the way the mountain looks at weather, patient, immovable, entirely aware of its own weight. "I'm taking her out of this house. If you want to stop me, you're going to have to decide right now whether Lawrence Caldwell is worth the kind of trouble I will bring down on this town if you try." Webb's eyes went to Prudence, to the blood on her face, to her hands wrapped around her own ribs. Webb had 2 daughters. He had been ignoring that particular fact about himself for 4 years. "Where are you taking her?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere warm, somewhere he can't follow." There was a long pause. The blizzard screamed around the eaves of the house. Lawrence, still on the floor, started to say something. Webb looked at him. Looked at him for the first time, Nate thought, as what he actually was, and said flatly, "Be quiet, Lawrence." It was a small thing. It would not have satisfied a jury or a conscience. But Prudence heard it, and something very small and very crucial shifted inside her chest. Nate carried her most of the way to the hotel, then found that the storm had closed the road north. They spent the night in the livery, which was warm enough with the horses in the hay, and where Nate cleaned the cut above Prudence's eye with carbolic and whiskey and set her nose with a brisk, practiced efficiency that made her grip the stall post hard enough to leave marks in the wood. "You've done that before," she said, when the worst of it was over, her voice thick and strange in her own head. "Animals," Nate said. "People too sometimes." Mountain doesn't much distinguish. He was wrapping her ribs now, passing the bandage around with careful hands that never once pressed harder than necessary. "2 cracked, I think. Maybe 3. They'll mend." She looked at his face while he worked. The scar along his jaw, the careful economy of his movements, the fact that he had not once asked her what she had done to bring this on herself. "Why did you come in?" she asked. He tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels, looking at her with those pale green eyes that didn't look away, "Because the whole rest of the street decided not to," he said. "And something in me objects to that." The weeks that followed were not gentle, they were real, which was different. Prudence could not go home. That much was clear to everyone, including Constable Webb, who appeared the following morning at the livery with the expression of a man who had spent the night arriving at a decision he was not comfortable with and had made anyway. He told her, quietly, that Lawrence had already been to see the town solicitor, that there would be papers filed, that a husband had legal standing that was, at present, considerable. "I know," Prudence said. "I am not telling you to go back," Webb said with some difficulty. "Good," she said. "Because I'm not going." She stayed at the hotel for a fortnight, then accepted the offer of a room from Mildred Tate, who had apparently been waiting for years for someone to give her permission to do something useful. The town of Harrow's Crossing, which had mastered the art of looking away, began, haltingly, imperfectly, the way rivers change course, slowly and then all at once, to look directly at what it had permitted. Dr. Forsythe filed a medical report he should have filed years ago. Two other women on the street came forward to give statements, not about Lawrence specifically, but about what they had heard and ignored and how it had felt to ignore it. Webb wrote a letter to the district magistrate in Calgary that cost him 3 hours and a great deal of sweat. Lawrence's cousin had never been a brave man. But some situations become impossible to call anything other than what they are. Nate stayed through December, which he would later attribute to the pass being closed, which was true but not entirely complete as an explanation. He came by Mildred's house every few days. He never stayed long. He brought things: a brace of rabbits, a jar of rendered fat for Prudence's healing skin, once a small bundle of dried fireweed he'd found in the lining of his pack from the previous summer. He sat at Mildred's kitchen table and drank black tea and said little, in the unhurried way of a man who did not feel the need to fill silences. Prudence found that she had forgotten silence could feel like anything other than dread. She began to sleep through the night. Not immediately. For the first weeks she woke at every creak of the house, her heart slamming, but slowly, incrementally, the way the body concedes to safety when it has been presented with enough evidence to start believing in it. She started sketching again. Nothing remarkable. Just the frost patterns on Mildred's window glass, the bare architecture of the birch trees across the street, the shape of the mountain against the winter sky. Mildred found her at it one morning and didn't say anything, only set a fresh cup of tea at her elbow and moved away quietly, which was exactly right. In January, the magistrate's ruling arrived from Calgary. Lawrence was formally charged with causing bodily harm. It was not everything. The law in 1887 was not built to give everything to women in Prudence's position, and she was not naive enough to expect it. But it was something permanent and official and written down, which meant it could not be taken back or explained away over rye whiskey. The morning she heard the news, she walked to the end of Birch Hollow Road and stood in front of the house that had been her cage for 4 years. It looked smaller in January daylight than it had ever seemed from the inside. Smaller and meaner. The gray paint peeling at the window frames. The porch step cracked where it had always been cracked. She stood there for a long time. She did not go in. She turned and walked back to Mildred's, and on the way, she stopped at the outfitters on the main street and bought herself a good pair of leather work gloves, the kind a woman who intended to do physical work with her hands would need. By February, the pass had been open for 3 weeks. Nate had not left. He had, in the interim, taken a contract with the Calgary lumber operation that required him to be present in the valley through spring survey season, which was practically adjacent to Harrow's Crossing and therefore rendered his continued presence geographically sensible, if you chose to account for it that way. They walked together most evenings when the cold allowed it, up the trail above the Tate property, where the birch grove opened onto a south-facing slope that caught the last of the late afternoon light. Prudence had told him over the course of many of these walks things she had never told anyone, things she had not even fully articulated to herself. The particular loneliness of being in a house with another person and feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. He listened the way he did most things, completely without interruption, without the impulse to fix or diminish. "You never told me what brought you through Harrow's Crossing," she said one evening. The snow blew in the fading light, their breath making small temporary clouds. "Supply run," he said, "was heading back through when the storm came in, and if the storm hadn't come..." He looked out over the valley, the long white field of it, the dark line of the tree line, the peaks behind. "Then I'd have missed it," he said simply. She thought about that for a moment. "I used to pray for something to change," she said. "Toward the end, I'd stopped believing anything would." She paused. I think I'd stopped believing I was worth changing for. He was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own texture. Then he said, "The mountain doesn't ask what anything is worth before it decides whether to hold it up." It was not a particularly poetic thing to say. It was the most practical man's way of saying something that, under any other delivery, might have sounded like a comfort she'd refused to accept. She accepted it because it came without ceremony or pressure, the way everything for men did. In April, when the snow began its slow recession up the slopes, and the first green things pushed through the mud at the edges of the road, Prudence Caldwell did something she had not done since she was 19 years old. She made a decision entirely for herself. She had been offered a position helping Mildred manage the dry goods accounts. Figures had always come easily to her. Another thing Lawrence had found a way to make her feel stupid about. She accepted it. She rented a small room above the post office, 3 blocks from Birch Hollow Road, far enough that she didn't have to see the house if she didn't want to. She bought a second pair of work gloves and a good heavy ledger book. On the morning she moved her few belongings into the room above the post office, Nate helped carry boxes up the narrow stairs. It was a practical thing to do given that he was there and the boxes were heavy. When the last one was set down, he stood in the small room with its one window, overlooking the street and its bare walls, and he did not say, "It's a good start or you'll be all right now," both of which would have been condescending, and both of which another man might have said. He said, "You want company for dinner? I'll be at the hotel until Thursday." She said, "Thursday's too long to wait." He smiled then, for the first time she had ever seen him smile outright. Not the corner-of-the-mouth version he used when something quietly amused him, but a full one. A little crooked that changed the whole geography of his face. That was how it began. Not with rescue, not with ceremony. With a woman who had survived 4 years of systematic destruction choosing, on a quiet April morning, to let herself want something small and good and real. Lawrence Caldwell was convicted in the Calgary court in June. He received a fine in a formal criminal record, which was not nothing, even if it was not everything that justice might have demanded. His commercial contracts dried up with a speed that suggested the business community had known what it knew all along and had simply been waiting for official permission to act on it. The grain elevator was sold. The store passed to a manager. Within 18 months, Lawrence Caldwell had relocated to Edmonton, which was far enough away that Harrah's Crossing stopped having to think about him. Constable Webb went to his grave 20 years later, having, in the last 2 decades of his life, handled every report of domestic violence in his jurisdiction with an exactitude that people found surprising and that he himself never fully explained. Mildred Tate lived to 87, remained furious about most things and fond of Prudence to the last. Prudence kept the room above the post office for 2 years, until the survey contract was finalized, and Nate came back from the high country in the fall of 1889 with a particular quality of purpose in his eyes. She had learned to read him by then. The small signals, the way his hands stilled when he was about to say something that mattered to him. They were married in October, in the church where Reverend Pickard had once offered her sympathetic eyes and no more. It was a short ceremony. Neither of them had any patience for ceremony. They built a cabin above the timberline the following spring, on the south-facing slope where the fireweed came up red and furious in July. In the evenings, when the light went long and amber across the peaks, Prudence would sit on the front step with her sketchbook, drawing elk and wildflowers in the shape of the mountain against whatever the sky was doing, and she felt, with a fullness that the broken woman on the kitchen floor could not have imagined, that she was finally drawing her own life with her own hand. The mountain held her up. It always had. She had simply needed to survive long enough to climb to it.